In this video, we're going to look at what are null and undefined in JavaScript. In JavaScript, null and undefined are primitive values. As null and undefined primitive values, we can use them directly in the console. Let's give this a go. If we type null, we get null returned. If we type undefined, we get undefined returned. We can create variables using either const, let, or var, and set them to null or undefined. Let's have a quick look at this. We'll start by creating a variable using let, and we'll call it first. We'll assign to this null. Next, we'll create a variable using var called second, and we'll assign to this null. Lastly, we'll create a variable using const called third, and assign to this null. Let's console log each of these variables. We get null returned each time. The same would happen if we created the variables using undefined. So let's look at null some more. What actually is null? Well, null represents nothing. So more simply, it's a non-value. So for example, if you opened the fridge to look for some milk, but there wasn't any in there, you could say this is null. In JavaScript, we usually set null intentionally. You could create a variable to store the value. In this case, we would call it fridge has milk. And you would assign the value null to this variable. Let's give this a go. We'll use const, and we'll create a variable called fridge has milk. We'll assign to this null. Now let's console log the fridge has milk variable. Null is returned. But what about undefined? Well, undefined, on the other hand, also represents no value, but it's less common to assign a variable the value of undefined. Undefined can be returned to us in a form of an error, or it will be returned to us if we declare a variable, so we give the variable a name, but we don't initialize it by assigning a value to the variable. So let's try the same example again, but this time we won't initialize the variable with a value. So we'll create a variable called fridge has milk using let. Then let's console log this variable. We'll save this and run the code. We get undefined returned because the variable was not defined with any value. So there's a few things to note here. You can't declare a variable which you do not initialize with a value when you're using const. You can only do this with let or var. If you try to do this with const, you'll get an error. So in our code, let's change the variable to use const. We'll save this and run the code again. This time, we get an uncaught syntax error with the message missing initializer in const declaration. So you must assign a variable created with const a value when you create the variable. One time that you might see undefined is if you are working with a string and you look for an element which does not exist. If we take the string ice as an example, strings are 0 indexed, so if we then look for the fourth letter in the string using bracket notation, we'll get undefined returned because the string ice only has 3 letters. The indices start counting from 0 and there's no fourth letter. Let's give this a go. We'll try this in the console. We'll use let, and we'll create a variable called rstring. We'll initialize this with the string ice. Next, we'll try to access the fourth element. So we say rstring, square brackets, and pass in 3. When we run this, we get undefined returned because the fourth letter of the string does not exist.